great interest in our lab since I came to MIT was to look at biological materials. And the background for this really is what fascinates me about biological materials, and this includes materials in our body, materials such as spider webs, silk, cocoons, any kind of things that biological systems make and use to survive. It's fascinating there is that these materials, if you measure their properties, right, and people have done this over the decades, and they measured the strength of bone and spider silk and other materials, they're very strong, they're very tough. They're interesting for engineers because they can rebuild themselves, they can heal, and so on. Now, it's interesting that these functions, which apparently are very good, right, are actually achieved by very simple building blocks. And that's what really fascinated me when I first looked into this, because now, since we understand things from the molecular scale, we can sort of look at this and say, well, if you think about steel, the bonds in steel are very strong, right? They're very strong bonds between the molecules and the atoms. Now, if you take a look at spider silk, or you can find the bonds are actually very weak. And so the question that really drives many of the projects in our lab are answering this question. How is it possible that a material like silk or bone or other proteins in our body can be so functional, even though their interactions, the chemical bonds, the structure of molecules is very simple? So engineers have sort of followed another way. They've engineered building blocks. They use building blocks that are very, very good. And the materials they make are also very, very good, reasonably good. But if you compare how much function you get out of the building blocks, you can see that we lose a lot of the function. So the strength of the bonds in steel or in glass or in these materials actually is only seen to a fraction at the macroscopic scale. Now, in spider silk, the strength that you have at the nanoscale, at the molecular scale, the chemical bonds in the material like spider silk are essentially visible almost 100% at the macro scale. That's absolutely fascinating. So what this would mean, if you think about steel, it would mean that if you were to make something like spider silk out of steel, okay, then the material would be 1,000 times stronger, or some number. Okay, and clearly that's absolutely stunning. As engineers sort of got away with this because we can use energy to make these materials. Right? We can use a lot of heat. We can burn the steel. We can heat it up. Concrete is made in a similar way with very high energy consumption. We have resources that actually allow us to use very strong building blocks, very strong bonds. Now, in biology, it's an interesting question now, because in biology, those kinds of conditions, such as a steel processing plant, do not exist, right? And they have to sort of build things like spider webs out of what they have in the environment. And that question is absolutely fascinating. Now, and we have looked into this by comparing, essentially. So this really drives the interest in both engineered materials and biological materials. We do both. And we really like to get to the point where we can understand what's missing in these engineered materials that would allow them to reach these factors of strength, factors of toughness increase that we have in biological materials in comparison. So spider silk was a material that we started to look at many years ago. In the beginning, we were very modest. We looked at the individual proteins that make up this material. And what's interesting now, biological materials are different than many engineered materials in that they have a great level of disorder in the structure. So if you look at them, you can't really pin them down. You can't really say this is a crystal, like an FCC, face-centered cubic crystal, like engineers like to think of copper as a face-centered cubic crystal. And now, spider silk is not really a crystal, but it's also not really amorphous or completely disordered. So it's something in between. And really, a lot of the time in the beginning we spent in really understanding the structure. And here is a great example of how computation and experimentation really come together, because computationally, experimentally, we cannot just look at the structure. Even though these experimental tools have advanced to great levels, we can't really yet see this structure of silk atom by atom. Computationally, though, we have now tools from protein folding, which was mainly used in the pharmaceutical industry, drug design, other techniques, and biology for understanding enzymes. We've applied these types of methods now to spider silk. Okay, and so now we could predict the structure of spider silk with atomistic resolution, and we could then compare the kinds of features, signals that we would see in an X-ray experiment, for example, experimentally. We could validate this, but we could fill a gap. We could actually predict the real structure with atomistic resolution of this material. And so these things go hand in hand. So we have validated the model, we have filled the gap, and based on this, we then went through different scales. So we basically simulated the atoms, the molecules, how they behave under mechanical stress. And through the years, we eventually worked our way up all the way to the spider web, and we now have a model that allows us to predict behavior of a spider web really with knowledge and understanding of all these different things that happen. And I can talk a little bit more about these at different scales. Right? So it starts from sort of thinking about individual chemical bonds, the sequence of a protein, which really is defined by the genetic information the spider has. We have formation of structures like fibrils and fibers, and eventually spider threads, which make a spider web. And then we have a very interesting complex geometry of a spider web. And sort of you can combine all these different features, and you can imagine that a lot of interesting things might happen if you start deforming the material, if you expose the material to extreme stresses, if you imagine the interaction with water at different temperatures, and so on. And that's really what we've done. So we've went through and analyzed all these different scales, and what we found is, and Spider Silk was a very successful example, if you wish, where we actually could make this happen all the way from the atomistic scale all the way to the web, which is nice because everyone has seen a spider web, and it's something, like I said earlier, you can do experimentation really on spider webs yourself. And so this was a great example for us to demonstrate the power of this approach of combining multi-scale modeling simulation from the chemical to the macro scale and experimentation. And what we found is the spider web, the properties of Spider Silk are remarkable. Right? So they actually have the strength of steel and very high toughness that rivals many engineered materials. And what is different, though, is you could say, well, let's just use steel. Well, the difference is that the basis to Spider Silk is something that's much less expensive energetically and probably structurally as well, sort of from the basic building block point of view, than steel. All right, and so somehow in Silk we have a mechanism, a paradigm where the building blocks are weak, but the function is as good as another material that we have made in engineering, which has the same properties. And so it comes down to effects that go across different scales. What we find now is we cannot understand Silk as a material where we can take the building block and sort of predict from that directly what happens. Rather, what we see is that mechanisms happen at different scales. So you have molecular unfolding sort of responses of individual molecules, with very particular, interacting in a synergistic way with the way fibrils organize and how they behave under stress, and eventually all the way up to the spider web, which has a particular geometry. Sort of, if you just take these three scales as an example, you can see that each scale has a very particular role to play in defining the overall behavior of the system. And sort of it's intriguing now that each little piece, which by itself might seem weak, meaningless, or useless, or even redundant, actually has a role to play in building this network of things that happen, mechanisms that happen, that give rise to the overall function of the material. So we see the material as a system that has functions. And it's almost, I like to describe it like this: if you imagine a bunch of particles that you put in a solution, atoms, and it's known, so you can melt them. They can be liquid or gas, and if you cool the temperature, they will organize into a crystal. And sort of the building blocks are very simple in this case, right? And what you see is phenomenal. You see a formation of long-range order based on building blocks which only interact in pairs, say. And the same kind of thing happens in a spider web, if you wish. But now the building blocks are not real physical things. They are at some level, but really they're functional entities that are in an abstract space form a network of interactions. Right? So there's now a single molecule that interacts with something that happens that emerges out of millions of atoms and molecules interacting. And these two pieces together, which are two building blocks in that abstract sense, now give rise to the phenomena like extreme strength, extreme toughness. And we realized that in modeling these types of systems now, it gets complex, right? And so we needed new mathematical tools, and we found them in a mathematical branch called category theory, which is a way of categorizing very systematically and in an abstract way the behavior of these systems. And now we can write down how the interaction happens between a single molecule and a group of millions of molecules which do a certain thing, and eventually also with a spider web. But in that description in category theory, all these bits and pieces are sort of one box, one sort of entity. Okay, and we can very effectively describe how they interact with one another and across the scales. And what we can do with this, we can write down sort of what makes a spider web function and what gives rise to these really intriguing properties. And when we use category theory, we can actually, I think for the first time, sort of write down the answer to these questions that have puzzled us for so long, and how the building blocks can be magnified so many times, and the strength can be, basically the strength at the nano scale can be mapped out to the macro scale. We can write it down, and if we have a model that we wrote down in these graphs, we can actually start to transfer this to engineering. And this is how we're hoping, in these approaches, we can actually apply this now to new materials. Because spiders are sort of limited in what they can use, and proteins are weak building blocks. But like I said in the introduction, if we can use something like carbon nanotubes or graphene to make something that would be as strong as graphene or carbon nanotubes at the macro scale, we would have materials that are 1,000 times stronger and tougher and more useful than anything we have today.